I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest updates from the battlefront, looking at the situation in Kherson and the east. We also welcome the Telegraph's technology correspondent and examine developments from the cyber war.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 15th of August, day 173. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, and Technology Correspondent Gareth Corfield. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Hi David, hi everybody. Sounds very dramatic. I hope you're still there, David. I haven't fallen under some heavy furniture. The main things over the weekend were the continued moves in the south, around the Kherson region. So this is the area that we've been looking at for quite a while, the supposed series of counterattacks there from Ukraine, which have yet to knit together into a much larger counter-offensive, for which you need the full orchestra and all the bells and whistles, and have planned it to a very high degree. So the counterattacks that we've seen, we think, have been limited, looking for opportunities, looking to test Russian lines, Russian strengths. Of course, all the time this has been going on, there's been the continued long-range artillery battles with the Ukrainians using the multiple launch rocket systems and HIMARS that the West have been sending in to degrade Russian artillery. And it's thought that in the east, the Russian artillery is down to about a half or possibly even a third of what it has been. So from 12 to 15,000 shells a day, that's now down to 5 to 6,000. So, still a huge amount of ordnance being thrown around, but very, very much down on what it has been. And that's partly because they're not there anymore. They've been targeted by HIMARS, but also partly because Russia have been making this move to the south to reinforce the Kherson region. Now, interestingly, so the Kherson is the only regional city to have been taken, only regional capital to have been taken by Russia, and the Russian forces are north and west of the Dnieper River at that point, and so it creates a bit of a bottleneck. And we've been watching Ukraine target this, nibble away at the edges, and we saw that long range strike into the Saki Air Base in Crimea last week, which we think is all part of this. But interesting, what we've seen is over the weekend, on Saturday night, a number of bridges across the Dnieper River into the area, like I say, to the north and west, where Russia has a large number of forces, were targeted again. The British MOD made a statement, Defence Intelligence statement over the weekend, saying that the two main road bridges across to this area were, and this is a quote, probably out of use for purposes of substantial military resupply. So, again, not utterly impassable, not impassable to civilian traffic, importantly, but probably not a viable route for the very heavy stuff. Russia now seem to be, they've constructed two pontoon bridges to get across the river, which will take, so it's nothing like as efficient, obviously, as if you've got a road or rail link. So there's significant strain being placed upon the Russian lines. There's reports that the Russian military headquarters for the region has moved south, has moved across the river back to, if you think of it from Russia's point of view, back to what they would consider their home bank. I mean, this is not home to them. This is still in Russian-occupied Ukraine, but they would consider that the safer bank. Moving your headquarters makes military sense if you're under great stress, but it's not a great morale winner when you see your headquarters move. I mean, no one wants to be too close to the headquarters. They have a habit of sort of disappearing in the middle of the night, HIMARS o'clock. But it's never a good thing to see these people moving away from you. So that is interesting. I think it's also very interesting that the way that Ukraine are doing this. Now we've talked before about how Ukraine, from day one of this war, have tried to fight a different way. They could not match Russia if in a toe-to-toe slugging match. So what they've done is be more canny about it. We've spoken in the past about the Western doctrine of the maneuverist approach, which is not just movement. It's not just moving your stuff around and coming up from an unexpected angle. That is part of it. But the maneuverist approach suggests a nimbleness of thought and an ability to do the unexpected and be able to fight a much larger force with a smaller force of your own. That seems to be what's happening here. So just very briefly, because I know we're still only on the opening bits of the news, but if you think about a military force that is the very basically the sort of the fighting bits and the supply bits. Now, of course, the supply bits have to do fighting themselves, but let's just think of it in terms of the fighting bits and the supply bits. Now, in the opening weeks of the war, Ukraine were very clever, and it takes great confidence to not go after the company of T-72 tanks, the 10 or 11 tanks there, but rather to strike the logistic tail behind them, the fuel and the fuel and water for the fighters and the fuel for the vehicles and the ammunition, what have you. I mean, that takes great confidence, great courage, great calmness of thought to do that. But you can target the fighty bits and you can target the logistic bits. What Ukraine seem to be doing here is neither of those two things. What they've done is they're not allowing those two parts, those two elements of Russia's military force to link up, because they have to, of course. The supply bits have to get the ammunition forward and the fuel, oil, lubricants for the vehicles, the rations and water for the fighters. They've got to get that forward. So you don't have to take on those bits. You don't have to take on the human bits. You can sever the link between them. So what Ukraine seem to be doing is very cleverly not taking on the might of the Russian army that still numbers, thousands of people in that region, and we think Ukraine are suffering after months at war. They need a break as well. But what they are trying to do, seemingly, is to sever that link. And in this region, that means dropping the bridges between over the Dnipro River, so between the sort of Kherson, in the Kherson Oblast, to basically to seal off those Russians north of the river. And it seems to be reasonably successful. We will have to watch it because, like I say, they've built these pontoon bridges. They can still move across. The command headquarters has moved back south, so they've not yet been able to strike that and deny the Russians the leadership element. But it does seem to be a very, very clever way of not meeting strength with what little strength you have, but severing those links, those all-important links between the two. And this should not have come as a surprise to Russia. It's in their history, right? It's Stalingrad kind of all over again, with the German Sixth Army being surrounded and cut off, and then slowly nibbled away out until it had to give up. So they should have seen this coming. They should have planned for it, and they're now extremely vulnerable. It's by no means ready, I don't think, for this larger counter-offensive. But this is a very, very significant move if Ukraine have been able to sever that link between those north and west of the river and those south and east trying to resupply them. We will have to watch out over the next few weeks, but I think that is quite significant. I'll take a little pause there, but bit more news to come.
Thanks, Tom. I'm not going to let you pause, actually. I've got a couple of questions just based on what you've said. Thank you very much for that. That was extremely comprehensive. Just in Kherson, how perilous do you think the position of the troops on the far side of the river, the Russian troops closest to Ukrainian forces, how perilous is their position now, considering they can only rely on pontoon bridges, which are under attack almost nightly? All this into context, and the events of the last week, supporters of Ukraine, how hopeful should they be from what they've seen from last week, from the strike in Crimea to the events of the last few days? Is this really? Do we think that potentially the war is turning course now, or is it too early to say that?
Right. Well, it's too early to say. First of all, we shouldn't be looking for this is a turning point in the war anymore. That certain elements of the media, I'm not absolving us there of anything in this, like to suggest that there are certain weapons that will be upon which the whole war will hinge. It doesn't. War doesn't really work like that. So no, I don't think this is going to be a significant turning point. This will throw up a number of thoughts, i.e. how important is that southern corridor to Putin? If Ukraine are able to push back and take the city of Kherson, and in so doing, either destroy a load of the Russian forces there, the thousands of Russian soldiers north and west of the river, or force them into a major retreat. If either of those two things happen, that will be very, very significant for both sides. Significant for Ukraine because it's a huge swathe of territory they'll take back, and a very symbolically important piece of territory. Also important for Ukraine strategically in terms of shoring up the international support for this war. There's long been chat that, as surprising as it was, as welcome as it was, Ukraine just surviving is now no longer good enough. Ukraine needs to demonstrate some kind of ability to push back against Russia in order for some of the more wavering elements of the international community to not say, oh my God, this is just going to go on forever. We need to sue for peace early. We just everyone needs to move on. I mean, I don't subscribe to that idea, but those thoughts are out there. And so the idea is that Ukraine needs to demonstrate that not only can they hold on, but they can win this thing. And that needs to happen probably before the fighting season really grinds down to a much slower rate in the winter, before the winter throws up those challenges for the West and energy. So there is a thought that Ukraine needs to do something now. So it will be operationally significant if they were able to do this, but I don't think it would be a turning point in the war. There's still a very, very long way to go. In terms of what this means for Russia, it depends if they can preserve their combat power, which means sort of getting out of there. If they are not able to look after themselves, not able to defend themselves and push forwards, if they're not protected sufficiently that they are safe from overhead fire, aerial fire, artillery, air, loitering munitions, etc., etc., then they need to get out. So preserving combat power is good. I mean, we spoke before about when Severodonetsk fell and Lysychansk, and Ukraine managed to get the vast majority of its forces out. We were talking in terms of comparing it to Dunkirk, and it's good to be able to preserve your fighting power for another day. But as we said at the time, Churchill then said, "Victories are not born of glorious retreats." So going backwards is not really what you want to be doing as a military force. But if you go backwards in order to preserve your fighting power and come back another day, that is better than just standing and fighting for the sake of it and losing everything. So it kind of depends what Russia wants to do and what they're able to do. Now, it looks like the command elements have got over the river back to the relative sanctuary of the southern bank, the left bank, you talk about a river in terms of the way the water is flowing. So the water flows out to the Black Sea. So the left bank, the south bank, Russia's bank, looks like the command element have got over there intact and successful, and that is no mean feat. You've got to think about how you command whilst on the move. It is no easy task to do what's called either a forward or in this case a rearward passage of lines, to move back through your own lines and still maintain efficient control. So they've achieved that. That was a fairly slick military operation. So the command element's still there. Now whether they are able to enact either a defence of where they are or a withdrawal, and whether they're allowed to politically, these questions are still up for grabs. But no, we absolutely cannot write off this Russian force yet, and we certainly can't say that this is any great moment, any turning point in the war just yet. It's far too early to say that.
Thank you very much for that, Dom. Gareth, I realise you can't stay with us that long, so I'd like to bring you in here. Last time we spoke was a few months ago now on how you saw the cyber war element in this conflict change and what was going on there. What updates do you have for us?
So in terms of developments in the cyber war, I think the main theme we've been seeing, sort of slightly detached position here in the West, is that things have calmed down a bit. Now, a few months ago, we were looking at the prospect of outright cyber warfare. We were looking at all of the rumoured capabilities of Russia's intelligence agencies and their hacking capabilities being turned against Ukraine. And a lot of analysts were predicting we were going to see finally this would be the first major cyber war. And without knocking the fact that the Ukrainians undoubtedly will see it that way and have experienced it that way, I do think what we've seen is that actually the cyber war is starting to calm down a bit. So the highest profile incident we've had to date was when what they call the In-Destroyer malware, which was a cyber attack against a power station. That particular malware, a particular strain of malicious software, was specifically developed for that attack and was deployed against a power station. Now, the Ukrainians and their Western allies caught that just in the nick of time, and it was a very good thing they did so. Otherwise, that would genuinely have caused some fairly widespread and easy-to-imagine effects in terms of power blackouts and availability of electricity generation. But since the In-Destroyer malware, what we've actually seen is that things have wound themselves back a bit, or rather the Russians have wound themselves back a bit. So instead of looking at large set-piece, high-profile, high-impact attacks, we're now seeing more of a focus on lower-level strains of malware, lower-level attempts to infect and compromise Ukrainians, work devices, email accounts, online presences in whatever form on social media and professional networking media sites, and so on. So something Viktor Zora, who is the Ukrainian sort of lead cybersecurity official, said at the Black Hat conference last week, which is a big hacker convention in the US. He said that so far the Ukrainians have tracked 1,600 major cyber incidents. Now, he didn't elaborate on that figure, so we don't quite know whether that means it's similar things to In-Destroyer or whether it's what we've seen more of, which is the so-called wiper malware. Now, the wiper malware is equivalent to dropping a bomb, basically. You get this malware onto a target device through whatever means available. Maybe you send them a phishing email, you maybe send the victim some sort of really enticing thing that they desperately want to click on, and when they click on it, it opens the malicious software and it runs and does its damage. Now, that's interesting because the wiper malware is a scorched earth weapon. It destroys everything on the target device that it hits. So if you install it on your work computer, for example, if you're unlucky and get hit in that way, that wipes not only your machine, but potentially the machine of your employer, your company, or the state agency for which you work, which is one of the reasons that the Russians are very keen on that. But what we're told, I think I've got the figures in front of me here. I think it was Cisco Talos who pointed out that they've seen a 6-fold rise in worldwide detections of new wiper malware strains since the outbreak of the Ukrainian war. And they contrast that and say that previously they were finding maybe one or two strains a year in the decade leading up to this. So we're definitely seeing a sort of a lower level but potentially much more destructive, albeit less visible, form of Russian cyber attack going on now in the last few months.
And just for people, for outsiders from this industry like me, what do you make of the fact that there are more lower level attempts? Is it easier to do that? Is that why are the big set piece events like hacking a power station or something? Are they a lot more difficult? Why do you think the Russians have altered their tactics?
Yes, the big high profile tactics tend to generate big high profile responses. So in the wake of the In-Destroyer malware attempt against the power station, what we saw was a lot of very high-profile attempts by the West and the Ukrainians to respond to that, detailing the malware, exactly how it worked. Here are the weak points. These are the bits that if you're defending against this sort of thing, you need to watch out for. All that kind of really useful industry-facing advice that says we've seen something big and unusual. You need to target, you need to take appropriate precautions. Now, winding that down to this kind of wiper malware, this lower level threat, I think that tells us that it needs less in the way of resources from the Russians to deploy. It uses methods of malware distribution that are well understood within Russia and indeed the wider world. Simply sending phishing emails or targeting people's social media accounts with direct messages saying, "Oh, I've seen this. You have to click on it." So it's a much lower effort to deploy those. It's well within the reach of people, like you and I, frankly, who have sort of average skills. We can be sat in front of a computer and told, right, click here, send that message, target that person. It's straightforward, it's simple, it can be done with a minimum of resource. So yeah, I think that's what we're seeing there, is a sort of desire to sort of wind things down a bit, but also to sort of tie those into where the conventional Russian forces are operating. So there have been rumours that these wiper malware incidents have been correlated with attacks on the ground by the conventional forces Dom was speaking about. So, for example, we might see a wave of wiper malware incidents that sort of track at the same or occur or are visible at the same time as a Russian military push into a certain area. So the thinking there is that this is an attempt to sort of sow confusion and doubt and paralyze the ability of the Ukrainians, civil and military institutions to respond to local situations as they develop.
Could you just colour that in for us a little bit? What would that look like on the ground if a Ukrainian unit was, or a section of the armed forces was coming under that sort of assault?
So what we would see is the ability of the Ukrainians as a command and control to being, to use a military term, being degraded. So you would see commanders sort of slowing down. You see the critical IT systems they rely on to harvest and disseminate information, to make command decisions, sort of becoming unavailable to them. It would have the same effect as dropping a physical bomb on an HQ. But the difference, of course, is that all the HQ personnel are there, but instead of dealing with casualties or whatever, they're sitting there swearing at the IT and cursing whoever it is who's deployed this terrible thing against them. So it is that sort of, it introduces that paralysis. It also has that problem, it causes that problem for the civilian authorities, their ability to mobilise resources to deal with the aftermath of bombing attacks, to dispatch ambulances, to care for the civilian population in the way that they obviously need to. So while it's less higher profile in the West, from our point of view, certainly it has a big destructive effect, which we just simply may be overlooking now, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Gareth. Dom, you've been listening to that. Do you have any questions for Gareth, or shall we move on and talk about the Wagner Group?
I know, just got one, if I may. Hi, Gareth. Great to have you on again. We've been watching this for 6 months. Will you be able to give us a sort of high level view of how you see the electronic warfare capabilities and sort of hacking capabilities of Russia, both from the military side of it and from the state side? Because before the war, we saw all the troll farms and the Internet Research Agency and what have you up in St. Petersburg. There's been a fairly steady drip feed over the last few years of really quite subtle comms there and misinformation, and yet then when there's the big green push, there's not been the sort of comparable effect on the battlefield. I wonder if they are not sufficiently well knitted together, or am I just hoping for much greater coherence where there is none?
Yeah, that's puzzled a lot of Western analysts as well, that question about that sort of integration between the electronic warfare stroke hacking capabilities and the conventional offensives. A lot of thinking on our side of the fence was very, on the Western side of the fence, I should say, was very much along the lines of, well, Russia's been perfecting its hacking capabilities for years. Now this is going to be its ultimate test. And I think in general, with the exception of the Indestroyer and Indestroyer 2 malware incidents, that what we were actually seeing there was a bit of a disappointing, damp squib effort from Russia. That's not to underplay what they have achieved, which has been sort of quietly devastating in its own way, but we haven't seen that sort of what many expected to see, which was that cyber capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities will be able to paralyse the state on its own. And if you're drawing a historical comparison, I suppose you could look back to the 1940s with Bomber Harris and RAF Bomber Command targeting Germany. Bomber Harris, the CO of Bomber Command, officer in command there, was absolutely convinced that his bombers and his bombers alone would be the way to win the war against Germany, and that all these other people in the army who were saying we need to invade them and depose Hitler and all this were completely wrong in his view. And of course, history turned out to say that view was mistaken. And I suspect that those in the cyber analysis community who were predicting back in February and March that we would see cyber capabilities used to degrade Ukraine's ability to wage war without firing a shot may have been mistaken in that regard.
Well, thank you very much, Gareth, for that. I know you have to head off, but that was extremely interesting, and do come back soon. Dominic Nichols, in your notes beforehand, you mentioned you wanted to speak a little bit about the Wagner Group. Please tell us, what have you learned?
Yeah, so this came out over the weekend as well. The Wagner Group, this group of alleged Russian mercenaries active in Ukraine, Syria, across swathes of Africa, Venezuela, etc., etc. They have been operating in Ukraine during this invasion. We think they were a large slice of the little green men in the 2014 invasion. But they supposedly had a headquarters set up, or a large headquarters element set up in Popasna, which is about 20 km south of Severodonetsk, over the weekend. There were photos. I've not been able to see if they were geotagged, or rather in time, to this location. But there were photos of supposedly Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man who is thought to be the main financier of the Wagner Group. He's known as Putin's chef. He's a restaurateur. He's got a number of lucrative sort of Kremlin catering contracts. He's from St. Petersburg, knows Putin of old, and because of his catering links, and he was filmed very sort of flamboyantly delivering a dish of food to Putin once. He was known as Putin's chef. Yevgeny Prigozhin was thought to have been at this location. We don't know if he was there over the weekend when, again, it's been geolocated that this location was hit by something, either HIMARS or we're not sure what. But the supposed location of the Wagner Group headquarters in the Popasna area was destroyed. And it's being suggested that was because of a number of posts that the fighters themselves had put out on their own social media channels. It was then open source intelligence and I guess Ukrainian military had worked it out and geolocated it and called in a fire mission on that. So that is interesting in and of itself. If that is the headquarters of the Wagner Group that's been destroyed, that's very interesting. If Yevgeny Prigozhin is in any way injured or killed in that, we'll need to keep a close eye on that. It does for me throw a bit of interest on the use of open source intelligence, and I got a bit of criticism. I got an email over the weekend from someone who said that I'm giving away too much intelligence, and the Russians don't need to do anything. They should just read the Telegraph. I mean, it's almost a byline the editor would want to put on the top of the paper. I doubt it, but they're saying that the Russians don't need their own intelligence. They just listen to you, read your stuff, and Ukraine would. I think it was something like Ukraine would lock you up. Anyway, made me think, made me examine my own conscience again, and I'm happy that I'm on the right side of this. Mike, you're right. Intelligence is information plus assessment. I am getting information from open sources, same as everyone else can. I'm talking to senior military and political leaders, foreign ministers, defence ministers, the occasional prime minister, president, etc., etc. I'm comparing their answers with the answers I get from, or to similar questions from other people. That these are all little bits of the jigsaw. I then stand back and I look at the jigsaw and I make my analysis. Now this is just my analysis. This is from the mind of Marge. This is Dom speaking. This is not. I don't get sight of anything from the military here or the government here that I'm then sort of passing on to you guys. This is open source stuff. I've just done my own thinking based on a military background and a little bit of thinking and asking questions. This is open source. This is not. There is no TS strap to Telegraph intelligence. I'm not giving away anything here. I don't think the editors would know what that was. I can't badmouth the editors. They still haven't signed off my Denmark expenses. But so I'm not giving away intelligence. I don't think I am. If anyone thinks differently, my DMs are open. Feel free to message me if you think I've got it completely wrong. And the ideas I come out with here are in the same league as what seems to have happened to the Wagner Group over the weekend. Then let me know. If I'm going too far, then I'll shut up. But I think I'm safe on this. I ask people who I trust, am I the right side of the line? And so far, everyone's saying yes. But let me know. But I think if this is correct, if the Wagner Group has been hit because they've been putting out information on Russian media and on social media, that is a glaring error of operational security, and they've been punished accordingly.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom. And as Dom says, do get in touch. I would be very interested to hear your thoughts and your questions. Delighted to be joined by Francis Sternley, our assistant comment editor. Francis, you've been listening to this podcast. What are your thoughts on what Gareth and Dom have had to say about the past few days?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, sorry that I'm late. Just had a meeting here at the Telegraph that perhaps I'll be able to talk about another time. Yes, it's been an interesting few days, hasn't it? Something that I've been pondering over the weekend and reading some analysis about is a theme that we were talking about last week at length, but perhaps in less of a sort of detailed way, which is about this possibility of the significance of not only the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, but also more broadly about Putin's grand strategy for the next few weeks, months, and possibly the winter. I'm reading some interesting sources that might be suggesting that there is now a very strong likelihood that Putin will try and declare some sort of ceasefire prior to winter, and essentially in doing so seek to arrange some sort of peace deal whereby he can keep those areas of the Donbass he currently has and Crimea, and essentially say, appear magnanimous and say, look, we don't want to risk there being some sort of nuclear escalation. We want to be able to resume oil and gas at the very moment when it really starts to bite for Europe, and essentially cut his losses and reopen ties, economic and diplomatic, with the West. And so I think we need to be very sensitive to this as a possibility now, because no doubt, as we've spoken about many, many times, there are certain countries in Europe that I think would be open to such an offer. Indeed, I think we don't need to name them, but I think there are obvious candidates for regular listeners of this podcast. And indeed, who knows, maybe even countries we don't expect if things get incredibly severe. I mean, something that I think we have to be sensitive to is that there are now many new leaders set to take over in countries in Europe, if they've not already done so, or leaders who are currently in power who are now severely weakened. I mean, look at Olaf Scholz. He's under fire in Germany. Macron, of course, has lost his parliamentary majority. Boris is about to be no longer Prime Minister here in Britain, and that will be replaced either by Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss. They are going to be inheriting a very, very challenging situation on many, many fronts, not only in terms of energy, not only in terms of economics, but just generally speaking, this is now a very challenging global marketplace. And so I think we just need to be sensitive to the fact that for all of the talk of resolve, it may well be the case that there will be people who will find an offer of a ceasefire from Putin very, very attractive. But what are the dangers of that? Well, of course, for all of the reasons that we've talked about, which is that if Putin is able to hold on to any of the territory that he's accumulated from this war, then you could argue that essentially he has won. Not initially what he sought to achieve, which was of course obviously the seizure of the entirety of Ukraine, but he has fundamentally rebuilt the premise that might is right. It used to be the case that you couldn't get away with this kind of stuff, but he would be showing the world that actually, if as long as you've got a long-term strategy and you can outpace the West, then you could succeed. So of course that's one of the huge risks from the Ukrainian perspective. As I talked about last week, the danger is, of course, that he's able to hold on to Crimea or those parts of the Donbass, that he will then resume hostilities again at some juncture when things are more favourable to him. That is, of course, a risk. There is also another side of the argument on that, which is that actually there wouldn't be a resumption of hostilities in Ukraine, because whatever the peace deal that would be signed, whatever the ceasefire would be one that would ensure that there couldn't be a flare-up. There would be guarantees militarily from Britain, Turkey, that if there was another invasion of Ukraine, that Russia would not be able to do anything. But of course, the other final point on this is, of course, that it should all be down to what Ukraine wants. It shouldn't be something that can be negotiated away. Not with these many atrocities on Ukrainian soil. Not when it's their sovereignty that's been impeded. This shouldn't be a conversation that's had in dark rooms between great powers, which of course is what, as I've talked about in the past, would be the sort of Davos solution. This should be something that if Ukraine want to keep fighting, they should be able to do so, for all of the reasons about what we've talked about in terms of what's at stake here. So, as I say, I think this is something that we need to be talking about, because the last thing we can afford, I think, in the West now is for Putin to once again be thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead and surprise the world so that they're not prepared, and then you'll have all of a sudden the usual suspects piping up and saying we should be taking this offer. And I don't think they will be thinking that through if that is indeed what they are saying and what they seek to agree to.
And that's certainly the Ukrainian position, isn't it? That a bad peace now means more war later. Dom Nichols, I believe you've got a question for Francis. Yeah, hi Francis. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on what fora there are that are really coming to the front of the war here. We've seen the UN try and act. We've also, you mentioned the sort of Davos community there, but I just wonder what groupings are emerging that do carry weight and where we should pay attention to see what the messages are coming out of there, or is it still just the central government edicts from some of the great powers of Europe, so to speak?
Well, I think at the moment it's not all coherent, and there's obviously a lot of conversations taking place in the UN, and but also I think you have to say that there are really so much of the decisions that have been being made are by individual powers, individual leaders, and whether that be Scholz or Macron or Boris Johnson here in Britain, and of course there's a strength in that because certain decisions made by, say, Boris Johnson helped arguably save Kyiv in those early days of the war, and so in that sense it's a strength, but also there's a weakness too, that when you have decisions that are being made by individuals, and it's not sort of an institutional desire to necessarily save Ukraine, you know, that it's actually a decision made by one person. I'm not necessarily saying that's the case in Britain. I think regardless of who would have been Prime Minister, that there would have been a very robust response from Britain. But let's take the case of France. Macron's been pretty strong on this, weak on other elements of it. But if you had a different leader there, who knows what may have happened back in February and in the months since. So what I'm saying is that there's a real danger here that if you don't have that, if it's all reliant on one leader and relationships that are taking place behind closed doors, all you need is for one new leader to come in who shakes things up and says, well, actually, I don't want to do this. I don't want to continue the support of Ukraine. And then things are in trouble. And I think there are certain trends that we can see happening in Europe that are steering slightly more towards that direction in more recent elections. Look at what's happened in Italy, for instance, where a much further right, more sort of pro-Putin or at least sympathetic to Putin power are now on the threshold of power. There's also, as I say, been shifts obviously in Central Europe as well that we've seen since the war began. So not sure if that specifically answers your question, Don, because it was a little bit crackly. But this sort of question around international organisations making decisions, individual leaders, is a really interesting one. And we spoke so much early on about sort of the European Union's handling of this, and perhaps they were too slow to respond, and it was actually individual leaders who basically took the impetus. But I think that conversation now about institutional support for Ukraine versus individual leaders' support is now more relevant than ever.
Yeah, sorry, maybe the question was a bit crackly, but I suppose I wonder if how important you think momentum is here. So we've got the Ramstein process, the US-led Ramstein process of military aid to Ukraine. Then you've got the process that, such as I was at last week in Denmark with the British Defence Secretary, this other process that's hard military aid, but it's also training and money. And there's a steady drumbeat of these things. It's almost as if they're trying to get into a sort of fortnightly battle rhythm, if you like, if I can use that expression here, because the next one of the sort of UK-led series of meetings is going to be in mid-September. So, you know, not far away. So I just wonder if in order to keep the momentum going amongst like-minded nations, these groups are going to meet more regularly, and they are almost challenging some of the other countries. So at these events, they talk about the fantastic offers that have been put on the table by country X, country Y, and country Z. And it's then very difficult, I suppose, for countries X, Y, and Z to come back and go, oh, no, actually, we didn't mean to send 15, we were only going to send 7, and they don't actually work, or what have you. So I just wonder if how important you see momentum amongst the groups, these ad hoc groups that have come together, largely under the Ramstein process, but are now settling down into a rhythm, and are meeting and are talking and are being able to refer to earlier decisions, and they've now got a little bit of history to them. If that is generating a momentum all of its own.
I think almost certainly. I think that when you have a sort of institutional meetings such as that happening regularly, then no doubt the relationships that will be being forged at those meetings will have an influence on the conversations that are taking place, the tone of them. It sort of confirms the solidity of opinion and everything else. So I think that obviously will build momentum in a way that is favourable. Although on the other hand, as I say, because power now has become so centralised, I would argue within European powers, not only within sort of bureaucratic structures, supranationals, etc., but also within governments. Just look at how much more powerful, say, Number 10 Downing Street is now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. That there is, as I say, always this other danger that however much maybe diplomats are meeting, senior ministers, senior officials, you're only ever one leader away from a plug being pulled or a shift in focus. And the whole sort of thing can slightly come crashing down, I think. And I'm not saying that's going to be the case on this one. I certainly think, if we're talking about Britain as an example, that if Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister, the current Foreign Secretary, then I think that there will be a robustness of opinion on Ukraine that will echo, if not even extend beyond what Boris Johnson was advocating for. But what I mean is that there will be other powers in Europe who are sending ministers to these kind of meetings, or senior officials who may change tone. And then, regardless of how regular these institutions and these sort of meetings are taking place, their hands will be tied. The amount of power that these officials have is sometimes hamstrung by the decisions that are being made very, very centrally by individuals or small groups of individuals. That's not a conspiratorial argument. It's just a fact that we call it sofa government or armchair government. Decisions made by small numbers of people. But as I say, in terms of the momentum as things stand, I think it's been very interesting. And of course, I'm getting part of this from what you've been reporting, Dom, about going to so many interesting meetings in recent weeks. Is that there is a solidity of opinion on this, that regardless of how much wobbling may be taking place or conversations about that in the press, that actually when you speak to the people who are making the current decisions, that there is a unity of purpose that's still very much intact. You listen to the remarks made by leaders now on the issue that are still saying, we must support Ukraine through the winter, that the Ukrainians must have the final say on what the shape of the war looks like, and that we will continue to support them in that. I mean, this stuff is still very, very strong, and I think that we should and the Ukraine should take reassurance from that, because, as I say, that if you are able to build these, I suppose, structures, these regular meetings that almost do potentially supersede individual leaders, at least in a day-to-day, week-by-week basis, then that will obviously be a very good thing, because you're stopping sort of decisions having to be signed off by those at the top. But what I'm talking about here is the sort of the grand strategy of thinking long term, and of course there are always risks of when you've got democratic cycles whereby leaders who were once very robust can then be superseded by another person who is less robust as things start to bite, and as people start to feel the consequences of decisions made by the predecessors. But of course, this is really a fundamental debate here about the sort of perceived advantages and disadvantages of democracies and autocracies. That democracies supposedly are able to act sometimes less quickly, less swiftly, less efficiently than autocracies, but ultimately they tend to get it right and they tend to get the decisions correct. But it can be a bumpy road. It can be a slippy process. And some people, particularly, I would say, well, on both fringes of the political extremes, look to more autocratic regimes, whether they be on the left or the right, and they think, oh, this is how things are done, because you have that sort of strength of an individual leader, and they're able to make decisions quickly and proactively and decisively, and in a way that many people, as I say, find very, very attractive. But what they don't see is that the long-term damage that's often wrought by these autocracies' decisions. So perhaps the way you could frame it around Ukraine is that Putin was able to act decisively and swiftly to invade Ukraine. But the point is that because he's an autocrat and all of the flaws that come with that, he is ultimately doomed himself and his country for the long term. So, as I say, there are all nuances and complexities to all this. But as I say, once you sort of start talking about these things as we have been today, it broadens out into much wider, I think, issues about the very nature of our political systems, really. So sorry if that's a bit of a much broader brush discussion than the one that you intended, Dom, but I think it's interesting, and hopefully that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, just quickly, Francis, on that. We mentioned at the beginning of this part of the discussion, the sort of Davos solution. Just so listeners are aware, I used to work at the World Economic Forum that puts on the Davos conference every January. So it might be useful, just sort of some sort of inside baseball on how this sort of thing works. The World Economic Forum, have actually in this instance been incredibly, they've got a position. They are very pro-Ukraine. Relations with the Russian government were frozen after the invasion. They weren't invited to Davos. The way the forum would think of this is that the forum's frameworks and networks would give them a good opportunity to bring the sides together for talks that would continue for a while. And then what they'd want is a big summit at the Davos conference in January. by breaking off relations with the Russian government so early, that might be in jeopardy. And also, but more fundamentally, this couldn't happen while the two sides while the Ukrainians have no faith in whatever the Russians might say. So in theory, if as Francis, as you say, that there is some idea that the Russians might want to move towards a ceasefire in the next few months ahead of the winter, then actually Davos might be quite a good framework for the kind of talks that would be needed to end this. But until the Ukrainians have any faith in what the Russian government will come out with, it just wouldn't happen. You can see Zelensky just wouldn't go, and the forum couldn't have that. You couldn't have a Lavrov on one side and nobody from the other side. So I think it's relatively unlikely. But it's these sorts of frameworks where diplomats will start to ask the question, where do these talks, if they're going to happen, where would they take place? But I think we're a long way away from that at this point. And the final thing on that, I think, is that the forum are quite sensitive to international public perception, and it would be very, very difficult for them to do this without Zelensky. They wouldn't really be able to move on this without the backing and without the involvement of the Ukrainian government. So I do completely take your point that it does feel like there's lots of backroom chats, and it's probably in a sort of shorthand way fair enough to call that the Davos method. But I thought that might be interesting for listeners to understand how it might actually work. Coming from somebody, I wasn't high up, just a grunt, I'm afraid, but somebody who saw some of the workings of the forum firsthand.
If I could just come back on that, David, I think that's an important clarification of what I was talking about. And I think there's just one other element to it that I would just want to unpack a bit, which is sometimes when I talk about sort of the Davos mentality or the Davos approach, there is a sort of another angle to that critique, I suppose, which is that I'm sort of thinking particularly about the remarks which were widely reported several months ago by Henry Kissinger, who of course was the sort of guest of honour of that, where he was sort of saying, that the war needs to come to some sort of end as early as possible for all of the reasons that we've talked about in the past. And effectively, there was a sort of analysis on it that Ukraine would need to be sold out for the good of Europe. That was essentially one argument that's put forward. I'm not saying that's representative of what Davos thinks, but it seemed representative of how a lot of people were talking about at the conference. And my worry, as I say, and I wrote a piece on this at the time, is that for all of the talk about strength towards Ukraine and long-term support generally for the cause of democracy and, if necessary, globalization suffering as a consequence, there is still this huge mode of thinking which is very, very prominent, which is essentially that the way to operate in the world is for big powers to eventually sell out small ones on matters of sovereignty so that globalization can continue unabated, that growth can continue unabated, and that actually this is in itself a good thing, that the more the world becomes bound together, then it makes wars less likely. It means that you're more that in a sense the way for Western values to be spread around the world is by opening your wallet, and so it's sort of money over morality. But I would say now, and I still think that despite everything that has happened, that is still the orthodox view, represented by those who are looking at this from a largely economic growth related perspective, which of course the World Economic Forum would do. But my response to that and my retort to that at the time was that if you are thinking only in terms of money and not morality, then you end up with Nord Stream 1s and 2s. You end up with you being reliant on Russian energy, Russian oil and gas, and you end up being reliant on rising powers like China in terms of manufacturing and everything else. And that emboldens them. It engorges them to effectively being able to act in the way that we are now currently seeing, whether that be in Ukraine or in Taiwan. So all of these things have consequences. And as I say, I think there needs to be a real humbling of an elite that has not been seen as a consequence of what has happened here, and an orthodoxy about the supposed positive impacts of globalization in terms of spreading Western values being seriously questioned. Because what we have seen in the case of both Russia and China is big investment from Western countries and capitalism, which was meant to sow this seed of Western values. And instead what has happened is it has, as I say, engorged them and has enabled them to act effectively with impunity, or so they believed. Now, I'm not saying, in the case of Russia, that they have not been severely rebuked and facing now severe consequences for their decision. I mean, if we believe the Yale paper that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, then the impact of this for Russia is absolutely and utterly devastating long term. So in that sense, of course, it has not been a success. But what worries me is, let's say there were some sort of ceasefire agreed in the coming months, or some sort of peace that Ukraine was unhappy with because they were pressurized into it. And then there was a resumption of Russian energy feeding into Europe, and a sort of a return to normalcy, that we will be back here again in the coming years, and we will be saying, why on earth didn't we learn the lessons back then? That's my main fear when I talk about the sort of the Davos mentality. It's sort of this kind of idea of globalization at the desire and the sort of pursuit of growth above all and everything else.
Well, thank you very much, Francis, for that. We're starting to run out of time, I think. Dom and Francis, can I just ask you for your final thoughts? What should our listeners be thinking of and looking to over the next few days?
Well, a couple for me, very quickly, if I may. Firstly, we still haven't had an answer from Russia about what happened in Crimea last week and the attack on the Saki base. And I'm wondering if the more they don't say anything, the more worrying that is, because it was a devastating blow. There's still images of huge traffic jams to get across back into Russia from civilians there. So the war has come home to Russia, and they're still, well, they've not updated their line that it was a couple of people smoking and had an accident or what have you. And I just wonder if there is going to be some response, or actually if there is, because there is quite frankly no response they can come up with, whether or not they're just going to sort of bite this one and move on. But I think if we've not heard anything by the end of this week, that would be the case. I'm still interested as to why Kyiv hasn't been hit with rockets as some sort of lashing out by Russia. So just for the next few days, I think we should just keep an eye on any response from Russia to Crimea. But I'm increasingly thinking that actually they've been shown to not be able to do that. And my final thought would be, I mean, it's very interesting what Francis was just saying about how this issue, the war has thrown up the failings and the fault lines of recent sort of global capitalist thinking and the sort of globalization debate. I'd just be very interested. This is not for now, maybe not in public, but I'd be really interested to chat to Francis and other people here at the Telegraph and see if this war had happened a few years ago, say 2015, would the Brexit vote have gone the way it had? But hey, I'll just leave that one hanging.
Yeah, we're absolutely not tackling that one today, Dom, but thank you very much. Francis, would you like the final words?
Yes, definitely one for another episode, I think, because there's just so much to say on that question. My final thought actually is a bit of an obscure one, for which I hope regular listeners will forgive me if it appears a bit too obtuse. But I was reading an interesting piece of analysis in the New York Review of Books over the weekend. I don't think it's the current issue. I think it's the one previously that I was catching up to. And it was a piece of analysis about a book written about wheat markets, which doesn't sound like the most scintillating subject, I must agree. But essentially it was talking about how wheat has changed the world in the past sort of couple of centuries. That essentially you had for a long time bread being something that was actually, fairly expensive to produce, and then America was effectively harnessed to be able to do mass wheat production. But of course in Europe, what is the main and foremost producer of wheat? The Russian breadbasket, as it was then known, or Europe's breadbasket, as it's currently known, Ukraine. And it was essentially contextualizing the war and in terms of thinking more about this food question than perhaps we have talked about on the podcast. Of course, we have addressed it at length, but I mean that it essentially was saying that if you're looking at Russian history from Catherine the Great onwards, then this value of Ukraine as a breadbasket and the leverage that gives Russia over Europe and gave Russia over Europe was so enormous that actually it's one of the things that's been misunderstood about this conflict, that Putin is clearly seeing long term, if he had seized the entirety of Ukraine, or indeed that he still would hope to be able to have significant influence over Ukraine, that it would give him so much leverage as food issues perhaps get increasingly problematic with climate change and everything else, then this is part of his broader strategy, and that we need to be proactive in acknowledging that, and as to why perhaps he was thinking about this. And I say it was just sort of articulating that essentially the war should be seen as a part of an imperialist conquest of an essential resource, of which energy was one and food was another. And in that sense, to the point that I know Dom has talked about at length on the podcast, that Putin comparing himself to a sort of Peter the Great type figure, it would really, really play into that. So I'd recommend that people read it. It's quite a long read in the New York Review of Books on wheat. But I thought it was interesting in terms of thinking about this war a little bit differently. And indeed, I think something that it would be good to do a full-length episode on at some point is just taking a step back from perhaps the Western perspective on Ukraine, as a sovereign nation, as a country that wants to become more part of, say, the European Union or NATO in the long term, versus how Russia sees Ukraine. And just have a whole episode of imagining how Putin sees Ukraine in the Kremlin. Does he see it purely as, in a sort of Machiavellian sense of like, this is just territory that I can take? Or does he see it more in this way of international brokerage? Or does he see it really genuinely, as he laid out in his essay back in July last year, as part of this sort of idea of greater Russia? Because I think that question of how it is perceived versus how it is seen in the West is one that is going to become into much sharper focus as we're talking about the long-term direction of travel of this war. And just one final remark on that, as was talked about last week. If there is going to be a serious counteroffensive or a very serious escalation of activities, it's going to have to be happening now or in the next few months, because once winter sets in, we're going to have a very big deep freeze, I think, on this. And what does that mean? Does that benefit Russia or does it benefit Ukraine? You would say that probably Putin's strategic perspective on that is that it benefits him because Europe will starting to feel the heat from the energy crisis. So I think Ukraine are going to have to be very, very sensitive to that. And no doubt that is a foremost conversation taking place in Kyiv as we speak.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.